I decided to indulge in a brief vacation to escape the monotonous surroundings of my flat and uneventful area. Seeking a change of scenery with mountains and lush forests, I opted for Colorado. However, my knowledge of the state was limited to the well-known towns, which proved to be quite expensive. Undeterred, I began exploring Airbnb options in smaller towns, although the choices within my budget were not as abundant as I had hoped. Eventually, I managed to find one that seemed reasonable and made the booking. The following week, I embarked on a road trip through the countryside, enduring a lengthy 10-hour drive to reach the Airbnb. I arrived at the town where I would be staying, and I must admit, my initial drive through it left me feeling quite uneasy. My expectations were not high, but this place turned out to be even more underwhelming than I had imagined. The sparse rows of houses were situated along a desolate and dimly lit road, with dilapidated wooden power lines barely holding on. In the darkness of the night, it almost resembled a deserted ghost town. During the day, the surroundings might have appeared less intimidating, but this initial impression was all I had to rely on. Fortunately, I managed to locate the Airbnb without any difficulty. I parked my car and made my way up the gravel path that led to a cul-de-sac, where my Airbnb and 4 other small homes were situated. After lugging my bags to the front door, I stepped inside. The space was quite compact, only 500 square feet, but I must admit that the layout was pleasant. I promptly dropped my belongings in the bedroom. I went to the kitchen to refill my water bottle and take a moment to relax before bed. As I stood at the counter, I heard a car approaching on the gravel outside. Curiosity led me to the window, where I saw a pair of headlights slowly entering. The car parked in front of the neighboring Airbnb, and the headlights turned off. Strangely, no one got out of the car. Deciding it was none of my business, I returned to the kitchen, not wanting to draw attention to myself. I sat on one of the bar stools, pulled out my phone, and responded to some messages, letting my family know I had arrived safely. After about 15 minutes, I called it a night and headed to the bedroom. I unpacked my belongings and began preparing for the evening when I suddenly heard the faint sound of a car door opening and closing outside. Following that, I detected the sound of footsteps approaching. Although it seemed like they were getting closer to my location, I assumed they were simply heading towards the neighboring house. The footsteps abruptly ceased, but I paid it no mind as I finished my preparations and climbed into bed. After about 30 minutes, I drifted off to sleep, undisturbed by any further noises. When I eventually woke up, I found myself disoriented and filled with a sense of unease. The silence of the house was only broken by the occasional creaking. I sat up, peering into the darkness of the room, trying to comprehend the source of my discomfort. Struggling to see in the dim light, my gaze eventually landed on the uncovered window, where a pair of eyes stared back at me. I felt a sudden surge of fear, causing my heart to race and my body to become completely still. After a moment, I noticed the figure moving away from the window. The sound of their footsteps was barely audible, and it didn't seem like they were leaving. I quickly jumped out of bed and rushed to get dressed. Suddenly, there was a noise coming from outside the bedroom door. I froze and listened intently as heavy footsteps moved away from right behind the door and hurried down the hallway. At this point, I was unsure of what to do, so I simply stood there, listening intently. I heard the footsteps go from inside the house to the gravel path and then down to the road. Eventually, a car started and drove away. After some time had passed, I cautiously opened the door and made my way down the hallway. As I noticed the front door left wide open and listened to the eerie silence of the night, I failed to detect the faintest sound of the man by my window as he made his exit. Although it seemed like he had vanished, I took immediate action by reporting the incident to a nearby police station, even though it was a 20-minute drive away. Unfortunately, there was no follow-up from the authorities, leaving me in the dark about the intruder's identity, motives, and why they chose to break into my home. I didn't stick around to uncover the answers. I reached my last stop before reaching my ultimate destination the next day. It was already late, and I felt incredibly drained from several days of non-stop driving. I retrieved my small backpack and entered the Airbnb, where I would be spending the night. It was a nondescript house situated off the main road, conveniently located along my planned route. I didn't do much investigation since it was just for a night, so all I needed was a bed to sleep in for 8 hours. As soon as I walked in, I immediately noticed an unpleasant smell. It wasn't particularly alarming, but definitely not enjoyable. It reminded me of a dead rodent under the house or mold in the ceilings. I quickly surveyed my surroundings, taking a brief glance into the bedroom and bathroom. However, I couldn't help but notice that the scent was much more potent in the bedroom compared to the living room. To be safe, I opted to keep my belongings in the main living area and made myself comfortable for the night on the couch. I grabbed a throw blanket from one of the sofa chairs and laid it out. Suddenly, a loud thump reverberated through the walls, causing me to startle. I felt more perplexed than frightened as I pondered the source of the deafening noise. It was difficult to discern which part of the house it originated from, as the sound reverberated through the walls. I cautiously ventured down the hallway, cautiously inspecting each room for any signs of trouble, but everything appeared to be in order. I wasn't entirely certain what to be cautious of, but I didn't think there was anything to be concerned about during my brief stay. I returned to the couch and resumed setting everything up before finally lying down. I took out my phone to do some planning for the next few days, but soon after that initial thump, I heard another one. The sound was eerily reminiscent of the initial one, reverberating throughout the walls. With a sense of intrigue, I rose from my seat and ventured down the hallway once more, determined to meticulously inspect every room. I flicked on the lights and carefully examined the walls and ceiling, but there was no sign of anything amiss. I began to consider the possibility that maybe a sizable branch was swaying in the wind, resulting in the unsettling noise on the roof. However, even that explanation appeared doubtful. I returned to the couch, reminding myself that I was only staying here for one night, and any issues were not my concern. I turned off the lights, laid down, and easily drifted off to sleep. The night was peaceful, and my exhaustion helped me sleep soundly. However, I woke up in an unusual manner. My eyes were still closed, and I had only partially awakened. I might have forgotten about it if not for what occurred next. A sense of unease filled my stomach as I opened my eyes, only to find a man standing directly above me, staring into my eyes. My entire body tensed for a brief moment before the man swiftly sprinted away from the side of the couch. And suddenly, I bolted out the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I sprinted, desperately trying to catch a glimpse of his figure amidst the looming trees, but he vanished from my sight. I closed the door and then went to grab my phone, but my movement halted abruptly at the end of the hall. From the corner of my eye, I noticed something peculiar. Hanging in the middle of the hallway was a folding ladder leading up to an attic. Without wasting any more time, I immediately called for help. It became apparent that the man had been up in the attic that night. However, There wasn't much up there to indicate that he had been around for more than a day or two. It's likely that he was simply using the Airbnb as a place to live. Nevertheless, his actions were deeply unsettling. If I hadn't woken up, I shudder to think what might have happened. At the time of writing this, an incident occurred only a few weeks ago. I had driven out to an Airbnb vacation cabin in a secluded, wooded area. My plan was to go on a backpacking trip with a few friends, and I intended to stay at the cabin for only 2 nights before continuing our adventure for the rest of the week. When I arrived and laid eyes on the place, I felt content. It was incredibly isolated, just a simple cabin which I found appealing. I parked my truck around the side of the cabin and unloaded my gear, bringing it inside. The interior was as expected small and not the most luxurious, but suitable for my needs. I paid for that night and quickly settled into bed, falling asleep easily. The next morning, my main objective was to explore the initial part of the trail where my friends would join me the next day. My main concern was to ensure that it was accessible and not too muddy from the recent rainfall. If it was, we would have to search for an alternative trail. I leisurely enjoyed a cup of coffee and relaxed until mid-afternoon. Later, I decided to take a walk down to the main road. The weather was pleasant and the trail looked clear and dry, so I didn't feel the need to venture too far. After hiking for about 4 miles, I turned back. It had only been an hour since I left, but as I approached the path leading to the Airbnb, I noticed a truck parked right in front. Curiosity piqued. I hastened my pace, uncertain of what was happening. Upon reaching the cabin, I went straight to the window of the truck, but to my surprise, it was empty. I scanned my surroundings, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. I scanned the empty surroundings and found no one in sight. As I approached the front door, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It remained securely locked, providing some relief. Stepping inside, I surveyed the interior, my heart pounding. It was evident that no one had entered, confirming my deepest dread. I meticulously checked every room, ensuring my worst fear hadn't come true. I opened the Airbnb app and reached out to the host, inquiring about their presence or the presence of someone else. As I anxiously awaited a response, I glanced out the windows, but there was nothing to be seen. The unsettling part was the lack of any visible paths or routes in the secluded forested area, with only a solitary cabin in the midst. Time dragged on as I continued to wait for a reply. With hours slipping away, I continued to scan the surroundings, desperately hoping for someone to return to their vehicle. However, as the sun began to set, the chances of that happening seemed increasingly slim, especially considering the time was approaching 8:00 p.m. I received a text indicating that I was the only one present, which was not entirely surprising. However, I had hoped that maybe, just maybe, there would be someone else here. After contemplating the situation, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease and decided it was best not to spend the night. As I began packing my belongings, I suddenly heard footsteps approaching from the front of the cabin. I paused and listened intently as the footsteps made their way onto the porch and towards the door. Time seemed to stand still as I waited for a knock that never came. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously approached the door and peered outside. To my astonishment, there was a tall man standing on the doorstep, facing away from the door and gazing out towards the truck. It sent shivers down my spine to see this motionless figure. As I gazed into the distance, a chilling feeling washed over me, hinting at the presence of another being. Instinctively, I took a few cautious steps back, attempting to silently retreat into the adjacent room to call for help. However, my heart skipped a beat when, on my third step, a floorboard let out an ear-piercing creak. In that moment, I could sense the man lurking outside, his movements growing more restless. And then, to my horror, I caught sight of the doorknob turning. Trembling with fear, he struggled to open it. I hurriedly retreated to the bedroom, frantically dialing 911 as the figure outside persistently rattled the door and pounded on it, only to abruptly flee from the porch shortly after. The sound of the truck faded away. The police arrived at the cabin promptly, but their presence didn't prove to be particularly useful. That night, I decided to leave the cabin and seek refuge in a hotel instead. The fact that the man responsible for the incident was still at large left me with an unsettling feeling. I can't even begin to imagine what he might have been up to. The thought that truly sends shivers down my spine is pondering where he could have been during that entire time. Was he lurking in the woods or hiding somewhere near the house? After going through such a terrifying ordeal, I doubt I'll be staying in another secluded cabin anytime soon. It was the end of April, and I was preparing to move out of my home in Chicago to Nevada. To make things easier, I hired a company to handle the transportation of my boxes to the new house. Meanwhile, I decided to take a road trip down there and enjoy some restful stays at hotels or Airbnbs along the way. I planned to drive for 10 hours each day and stay overnight at different locations, allowing myself some time to relax during the journey. The total drive would take approximately 30 hours, so I decided that my initial stay would have to be in a remote area of Nebraska. I scrolled through Airbnb in search of an affordable option in Nebraska, where there wasn't much to explore. My main priority was finding a place to rest for 8 hours before hitting the road again. I stumbled upon a cozy one-story home with 2 bedrooms, even though I didn't require the extra space. The price was incredibly enticing, making it a great deal. Although I didn't really mind the extra space, I did find it a bit peculiar that they only displayed pictures of 1 bedroom. However, it didn't really affect my decision, so I went ahead and booked it for the next night. The next morning, I packed up the rest of my belongings and set off on my drive. I left a bit later than planned, but I didn't think it would be a major issue, aside from having to drive in the dark for a few hours. If you've ever driven through Nebraska, you would know that it's quite uneventful. There are long stretches, hundreds of miles long, with hardly any buildings in sight. A couple of hours after dark, I arrived at the Airbnb. It was located off the long, empty road I had been on, down a short gravel path. Initially, I felt a bit let down as the exterior appeared much more dilapidated than what was depicted in the pictures. I reminded myself that I was only staying for a few hours just to sleep, so it didn't matter too much. I grabbed a couple of my bags and headed to the front door. Usually, the owners leave the key in a key box and give you the password, but the store had no key box. In fact, it actually had no luck at all. It was one of those plain doorknobs you'd usually see on a closet door. I began to feel a slight sense of unease, but with no other choices available, I reluctantly opened the door and cautiously entered. To my astonishment, the interior was surprisingly pleasant. Despite its small size, the living room and kitchen were tastefully furnished and appeared to be well maintained. I entered the first bedroom and noticed that it lacked a lock, but luckily the second bedroom had one. I decided to unpack in there. However, something about this bedroom gave me an eerie feeling. Right in front of the bed, there was a small old doorway measuring about 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. I even took a picture of this peculiar doorway in the room. The more I stared at the door, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't bear the thought of staying in a room without a lock. Out of curiosity, I attempted to open it, only to find it locked from the other side. I rationalized that it was likely just a storage space for cleaning supplies or extra towels, but nonetheless, the store gave me an eerie feeling. I was getting quite exhausted, so I only unpacked the essentials for the night and began preparing for bed. At some point during the night, I suddenly woke up to the sound of a gentle tapping coming from the edge of the bed. It was barely audible, but the entire house was eerily quiet except for the tapping sound. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand and hastily switched on the flashlight, directing its beam toward the edge of the bed. The tapping abruptly ceased. I'm not usually one to be easily frightened. I may get spooked or uneasy, but fear rarely takes hold of me. However, there was something about that tiny doorway at the edge of my bed, in that moment, that truly terrified me. I leapt out of bed, switched on the lights, gathered my belongings, and hurriedly fled the house as fast as I possibly could, all while the darkness outside still enveloped me. As I was backing my car out of the gravel path, the visibility was poor. However, something caught my eye, a figure lying on the ground behind the house. A sense of unease washed over me, prompting me to drive away quickly. After about 30 minutes, I decided to pull over and inform the owner of the house about the possible intruder. I sent a text message urging him to call the police. Continuing my journey for a couple of hours, I eventually found a small town and parked in a grocery store parking lot to get some rest. The events at that Airbnb still remain a mystery to me. The most unsettling part was discovering that my message had been read shortly after I sent it, yet the owner never responded.